Hi, and welcome to another 5G update. I'm Phil Harvey. I'm an editor at Light Reading. And this week, which is the election week in the US, the week of November 2nd or 3rd, I forget. All the days run together. We had the 5G Transport and Networking Strategy Symposium. And to help us recap a little bit of what was discussed from the optical networking side, Sterling Perrin of our Heavy Reading Analyst Group joins us to talk about optical networking and all that implies. Hi, Sterling. How are you?
Hey, Phil. Good to talk to you.
Good to speak to you as well. I do miss seeing everyone that typically goes to the transport, related events in New York City. That usually is a highlight of my year because I learn a lot, I eat great food, and usually there's some kind of weird weather event that we can all talk about.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite events too. It's, as you remember, just tracking that over the years, it went from this little tiny, one room event, as Gabriel had explained when he opened up the virtual event this year. And then it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And then we went online this year. We had to, of course, but I miss the gathering, but there were some benefits too, in that we got virtual, we got a more global audience and a more global set of speakers. So a lot more input, particularly from Europe, and also some Canadian operators this time. And we still had good engagement. We just, missed the food and I guess the weird weather.
What was always okay, I'll stop remembering and then I'll actually get into the topics. But one of the things that I always liked about that event that I thought was different than most other tech events that I go to is that the happy hour lasted for maybe 45 minutes or an hour as the session would close. And it always was supposed to wrap up at 6 o'clock or something. And you would come back, you would go to dinner, come back. There would still be people there at 9, 10 o'clock.
They were very happy.
Standing and talking. Yeah. It was a group that really loved talking about what they do and how it matters and where it was going and stuff like that. And I guess, in the optical networking space, I mean, it is, they're always just pushing the limits of what we can do, physically and how to make it work in a business context. And I think that's one of the things I wanted to start off talking about was network slicing, because that was one of the topics of one of your panels, network slicing for transport networks. I guess my first question is, what has to happen if we're going to take network slicing and make that happen all the way throughout, not just at the radio side, but all the way throughout the network? And then where does that, is there an answer to where that ends? Does it really, does that methodology completely separate the network, all the way to the core?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things where, if you think back to the last year's event to this year's event, there were things that had progress. And I would say probably that would be one of the areas where we haven't seen much progress. And it's new, the slicing is very much tied to the phase 2 types of services, right? Slicing is going to you're going to need it to do the ultra reliable, low latency, and maybe for some of the IoT stuff, and just to really get specific services to largely the enterprises, which operators are hoping will pay more for 5G and, et cetera, et cetera. Slicing's tied to that. Those services aren't out yet, so slicing's not ready yet. So, that's fine in that sense. But there are, the guy from Ericsson, Andreas Olsen, described it as the problematic wire, which I guess is the way the radio guys see it. Like, we'll figure out all these standards for slicing within the radio, and then there's this cloud thing you hand it off to, and ta-da. And unfortunately, once you do that, that handoff hasn't been developed yet, and it's still, from listening to Verizon and some of the panelists, I don't think we got a clear picture of who's running that show and what's the coordinated effort to do it. So
it seems like the early versions of network slicing are going to be radio only, and then it's all going to converge back into the cloud or the core, and kind of put it back into one bucket, so to speak.
Right, but there's nothing end to end. The transport network is inevitable.
Right.
And so if you haven't handled that mapping to the transport network, and that's, it's optical, it's up to layer 3, it's kind of transport broadly defined. If you haven't done that, then there is no end-to-end slice. If there's no end-to-end slice, then what have you done?
Yeah.
Nothing really.
Well, you probably, it's going to be a radio and software separation. This is this is interesting because this is kind of where we ended the discussion last year, was talking about like, okay, for now it'll be this radio and software separation,
Yeah.
and then something.
Yeah. Yeah. And I
So
mean,
we're not to something yet.
and the transport, one of the other interesting things that comes up with slicing is the transport. Sometimes people get confused about, well, what is slicing in the transport context? Is quality of service and network separation. And actually, transport has done a lot of those things for many years.
Yeah.
Segment routing will be an important part, and that brings in SDN control, and that's great. There's just various layer 3, layer 2 VPN types of services that can be used to do the transport slice, but it's, how does it interact with the radio, and what's being sliced there is, again, the big problem. So the transport people need to look out more broadly of like, what's going on the other side, and the radio guys need to really dig into that problematic wire and understand how that interaction takes place. And it hasn't, my sense was it still hasn't really, it's being discussed, but it's not commercializing. Whereas some of the other things that we've been discussing over the couple of years, you've seen more of a, getting to
There's
more,
more
knock on
movement.
it. It works. Yeah.
Well, then let's so we'll put a pin in that, and we'll discuss it at the next event.
I'm sure we will.
Hopefully in person.
Lots of research to be done there, which is good.
Another thing I hope we are treated to at the next event is an interview with Glenn Welbrock of Verizon. You spoke to him about how the company's handling its 5G traffic, front haul network, and actually he's mostly talked about in the past the mid haul part, I guess, and that's changed, right?
Yeah, and it changed to a degree because we put them on the mid haul and on the front haul session. So, but they seems like Verizon is now more willing to talk about what they're doing on the front haul side. So the mid haul, which we've talked about for years, they have a very packet centric approach to doing. Mid haul is packet centric, and they want to do that for their high band spectrum. So the millimeter wave that they blast all the commercials about that they have.
Right.
The approach to do that is going to be a mid-haul, which is a packet-based approach, which did leave the question hanging. What is Verizon? Is Verizon going to do front haul? What are they going to do? And the picture painted by Glenn at his keynote Q&A we had is that for their mid-band spectrum, which is now what they're moving to, then front haul very much comes into play for that for a number of reasons. And so we had a discussion, and through Q&A, of course, a lot of questions from the audience for Glenn. So they want to do a packet-centric approach to front haul. In fact, they're doing it, and they're in fact even deploying product now, which is this TSN, IEEE's TSN for front haul Ethernet standard that came out back in 2018, and now we see operators, including Verizon, like it. Vendors, including Fujitsu in Verizon's case and others, have commercialized product, and now companies like Verizon are actually deploying it. So that is definitely one of the areas where we talk about something conceptually back in, probably back to 2017.
Yeah.
People think that's kind of weird.
Yeah.
And then it sort of gains, it gets standard, and then it moves. So that was a great story of how the front haul is moving to packet.
Yeah, and it happened in telco terms, at really lightning fast. From concept to standardization to commercial deployment. So it does suggest, especially Fujitsu and Verizon, I think, are a good one to point at, where they're a lot more in lockstep than they probably would have been in the past on different things.
Yeah.
Seem like they're working very closely together.
Certainly on that. And then there's other vendors as well that have come out with the products. But yeah, I remember earlier on in this event, 2017, 2018, the idea that Ethernet could be suitable for a front haul link, which is very, very sensitive to latency.
Right.
due to the radio network restrictions. Nothing to do with the applications, but talking about microseconds,
Hmm.
and Ethernet being able to address that type of a network was, a lot of people were skeptical, and now it's we're moving forward.
Yeah, that technology certainly evolved. Speaking of, kind of another network evolution, as we're talking about edge computing becoming more important and becoming more central to service provider strategies as they're looking ahead to, how am I going to wring some dollars out of 5G now that consumers aren't really paying for it?
Hmm.
um, I'm sure they expressed that a little bit differently, but as edge computing becomes more important, how is what are some of the bigger technology changes and maybe hurdles that the network operators are solving in the transport network?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, edge is certainly critical to the latency piece, and
Hmm.
we did have a discussion on the on one of the panels on the phase two services panel about the role of edge. We had Digital Realty on there. We had Telefonica and a couple suppliers, Infinera and Acacia.
Yeah.
Um, where there's still being discussed where is the edge, and there's kind of the concept that there's going to be multiple places where the edge resides. I think one of those evolutions at our transport event over the years has been more, I guess, solidity around where the edge is, or maybe where it's not needed. And
Mm.
so I remember pretty distinctly in our first year back, it was 2017. There was so much hype around the edge is going to go, the data center right at the cell tower, and multiply times hundreds of thousands of cell towers, and wow. And
Yeah.
then that's fallen out the window. That's out of favor. So there's not, and I think it's becoming increasingly clear, you don't need that many edge locations in a city. It's sort of becoming, here's a city, we need some edge locations in there, but that's going to be kind of the hub, and maybe there's a group of different providers, from city to city that may change. We're starting to see kind of more momentum around that. So you're not seeing any of these companies like Digital Realty, in their case 275 data centers. They're very interested in the edge.
Yeah.
I don't see them deploying 10,000 data centers anytime
R-
soon.
right. Well, that's what there's a couple of companies that kind of have come up that were that seemed like their whole mission was to build giant data centers at the base of every cell tower on Earth. And
Yeah.
it doesn't sound like architecturally the operators are wanting to manage all of that.
Well, and it boils down to, it's about latency, and then what kind of latency is acceptable for applications. And you think within a city, to get within this 1 to 10, it's milliseconds. You're talking about 1 to 10, and maybe more depending on location. I think
Yeah.
people are finding there's actually a lot of applications that can be addressed by just having access to this data center and a meet me, so that it's the colo is something from our surveys and from the discussion that's an important, because it's where it is and it's who's there, and so you have access to the data center, and then in a very instant direct on ramp to a cloud
Hmm.
is a great thing, and it's not like it has to be 30 of them all scattered throughout the city.
Right. Yeah. I think it'll be down to maybe literally the application level, like where where carriers decide to put the most emphasis, in a region or what have you. Um, it's well, it's always great to catch up, you know, this time of year, but in general in optical networking stuff. Is there a particular, as we're rounding the corner and walking away from the burning embers of 2020,
Mm.
with the explosion happening in the background, is there a particular technology we should keep an eye on in the transport network for 2021 that's going to kind of jump to the forefront? Sort of like 800G kind of became a reality this year. Um,
Yeah, I think there'll be that stuff, but I think that the 400 ZR
mhm,
and the ZR Plus concept is still gonna be a hot topic next year,
mhm.
gaining momentum, even it seems into the telco area more than the traditional data center. And then one of the things that is quite new, that did come up on the Edge panel is the 100 gig coherent, which Acacia had announced back a
Right.
few months back.
Yeah.
That is definitely is something to watch. So, while everybody's moving up to 800 gig and terabit, Acacia, which, they're a pretty savvy group, realizes there's a momentum around 100 gig still. So, as we talk about all these new speeds, the 100 gig, it continues to exist.
Hmm.
And just continues to gain traction, kind of continues its march down market. So as we talk
Yeah.
about 400 gig and 800 gig and whatever, the bulk is still going to be around 100 gig, and still a lot of 10 gig, honestly.
Hmm.
Even Glenn Welbrock mentioned this in the Q&A. Just from a backhaul perspective, there's a requirement to move from 1 gig to 10 gig really across the country as you move to 5G. And he's saying out of their region, there's not a lot of that. There's still a lot of
Yeah.
holes. So that's 10 gig.
Yeah, I was about to say there's the thing when you're talking about a carrier, that's why it's always interesting to hear from a carrier the size and scope of Verizon or AT&T or somebody like that is like they have, they don't move all at once. They might be mentally, accepting a new technology, but there's an awful lot of stuff in the field that actually physically has to be changed, and that takes a long time.
Yeah, I mean, and there's even just practical stuff
Yeah.
that you get from the operators in these discussions. Which just one example I'll leave you with that you brought, you kind of reminded me of.
Hmm.
We were talking about the role of cable, DOCSIS plant for front haul applications, and Victor Esposito from GCI, which was the Alaskan operator, which is somebody we
Right.
wouldn't have got in New York City. So it was great to
Yeah.
have him. Said, we've looked at it, but the reality is, any of those places where you have that DOCSIS hub, there's fiber right there too. And as you're moving it, it's the higher speeds of DOCSIS means more and more fiber deep.
Yeah.
And he said, at that point, why not just go with fiber and extend it out? Why fight with DOCSIS when you have the fiber load? And so it's just one of those things when you talk about technology all day, things can be done technically,
Mm.
but then when you look at something from an operational standpoint like that, you quickly find, oh, well, why are we
Yeah.
going to do that? There's a piece of fiber right here.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that stuff,
It's the practical sometimes reigns on the parade of
it,
the cutting edge tech.
I would say almost always.
Yeah. And to that I say I'm going to go have a proper French press coffee now and wrap up this interview.
All
Even though
right.
I have an automatic coffee maker, I still like the old school way.
Good
Sterling
stuff.
Perrin, thanks so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
All right. Always great catching up, Phil.